to try and help workplaces stay safer and make sure that some of those businesses are respecting the conditions to be put in place. But this third worker confirmed dead as of Sunday. We're also expecting the Prime Minister to answer more questions about China after China saying this morning the Prime Minister's comments Friday were, quote, irresponsible. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada.
Before I begin, I just want to take a moment to recognize all those who've been affected by forest fires in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. This is happening in a period that's already very difficult. Our thoughts are with you and with all the firefighters and first responders who are working hard to contain the fire and protect people.
Very tough few months. For many people, it's starting to feel like we've turned a corner. Businesses are reopening their doors to serve their communities. Employers are putting new precautions in place to keep people safe. And right across the country, business owners are using the wage subsidy to get back on their feet and rehire their employees. By using this benefit, employers have helped 2.6 million Canadians stay in the workplace. These are jobs that people rely on to pay their bills and to put food on the table. Jobs that matter to Canadians and to their families. Take roamers in Vancouver and Port Moody. They used the wage subsidy to rehire over 150 employees and reopen their 3 neighborhood restaurants. Or Enable Education in Milton, who applied for the benefit and were able to keep a team of 18 people employed and busy. And that's what this program is all about. But even as things start to improve for many people, we also have to remember that some industries have been hit harder than others. And if you work in one of those sectors, it might take longer to find a job. In the coming weeks, we want you to be able to focus on finding work, not be worrying about your benefits. So, as I announced on Tuesday, we are extending the CERB by 2 months. This help will continue to be there for you and your family.
In recent months, we have introduced a series of programs to help Canadians get through these tough times. From the very outset, we said that as the situation evolved, our response would as well. So we decided to extend the emergency response benefit and the emergency wage subsidy. We understand the challenges people are facing now, and we want to give them enough time to find work. Of course, it's not always easy to go back to work. A lot of businesses will have to change the way they do things in order to reopen. If you have any questions about protocols or procedures to be followed during the recovery, we are now providing a number of resources for you. The Canadian Workplace Health and Safety Centre has just published on its website information on public health, which constitutes a great source of information. It has also launched an online portal where businesses can share their experience and best practices, whether they're tricks for disinfecting the workplace or advice on how to wear a mask. We still have a long way to go in the coming months. But by working together, governments, businesses, and citizens, we will get through this.
Businesses retooling their operations to produce hand sanitizer and people finding creative ways to stay safe. The last few months have shown us the power of thinking outside the box. Going forward, that will serve us very well. Because finding new ways of doing things and collaborating between sectors yields great results. In fact, for tech and agriculture, we've already seen that potential in action. As people around the world start eating more plant-based products, we have an opportunity to bring together Canadian innovation and Canadian crops, and a chance to create good, well-paying jobs. We've already invested in this space with the Prairies-based Protein Industries Supercluster, supporting thousands of jobs. But this industry is growing fast, so we're not stopping there. Today, I can announce that our government is contributing almost $100 million for the new Merit Functional Foods location in Winnipeg. This facility will be a world leader in plant-based proteins and will create good jobs in a fast-growing field. And by using 100% Canadian inputs, it will also support farmers who produce the canola and yellow peas used in Merit's products. Standing up for hardworking farmers, creating good jobs, setting up Canada for success on the world stage, these are things that our government will always get behind.
I want to close this morning by talking about what Canada is doing on the global stage. The pandemic has revealed gaps that remain and that are harming too many people around the world. Of course, for many women and girls, inequality in the area of health care is nothing new. It's a reality they see on a daily basis. Again now, women and girls have to fight in order to get basic care and die of diseases that can be prevented. Too often, the right of women to make decisions about their own body is questioned. Since we took office, we have put gender equality at the center of everything we do, and that's what we're continuing to do now. This morning, Minister Gold is taking part in the She Decides Now conference and will announce that our government intends to invest almost $94 million to support the health and sexual and reproductive rights of the most vulnerable women and girls in the world. That funding will make it possible to offer a range of services, whether it's helping midwives in Somalia or countering sexually based violence in Rohingya refugee camps.
The pandemic has been an unprecedented challenge for our country. It has also been an important opportunity to figure out what really matters in our communities, to have meaningful conversations about how we can take care of those around us, and perhaps, above all, to think about what kind of future we want to build together. We have the chance to shape our country and our world for the better, and I know that we're up to that task. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la conférence de presse par le téléphone aujourd'hui avec une question, un suivi. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you, merci. Please press star 1 if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 si vous avez une question. Première question, Michel Lamarche, TVA, ligne ouverte.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like you to comment on the agreement with Mexico about seasonal agricultural workers. First, can you tell us exactly how many other agricultural workers will be able to come in and the premises of that agreement? And also tell us about your own responsibilities. Well, first of all, anyone who works in Canada must be able to do so in a safe environment. Now, unfortunately, we've seen for too many temporary workers that is not the case. Now, obviously, we will be working both with the affected countries and business owners in order to ensure that right across the country, we have the proper protections in place for those individuals. So yes, we will continue to receive those workers. This is an important industry for the food chain in Canada, and we will be doing even more to ensure that all the rules are being followed and that anyone working here in Canada is properly protected.
I think it's obvious that we need to do a better job of ensuring that the rules are followed for temporary foreign workers in Canada. Obviously, they're an important part of our food supply chain. We need to make sure we're continuing to ensure and enforce the rules around how they are supported, how they're treated. Every single person who works in Canada deserves to do so in a safe environment, and unfortunately that hasn't always happened. So we will continue to work with Mexico and other countries to ensure that the systems are in place, that their citizens are protected while they're working here, even as we continue to receive people to work on our farms right across the country.
En suivi, Michel?
Follow up?
Bien sûr, j'aimerais aussi vous entendre
Yes,
sur
I'd
la
like you also to comment
régularisation du statut
on
des demandeurs
regularizing
d'asile,
the status of asylum seekers who were working in the healthcare sector during the pandemic. We were told that discussions with Quebec have been progressing, but it seems to be a lot more complex than what was initially stated. Are we getting close to regularizing their status? Well, we all recognize that those people who stepped forward to help us at a time of great vulnerability for our society and our seniors did a great thing by asking to help. And we've been working with Quebec and all levels of government to try and thank them properly. But at the same time, we have a very rigorous immigration system that applies in many different situations, and finding exceptions to that system is not something we can take lightly. So we're trying to work on this issue, but the fact is that when you have such a strong and well-established immigration system as we do in Canada, it's difficult to deal with exceptions. We are trying, but this is not something that's simple to accomplish.
Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse, ligne ouverte.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour,
Thank you.
Monsieur
Good
Trudeau.
morning,
Les
Mr.
compagnies
Trudeau.
aériennes canadiennes qui demandent
Canadian
de demander à votre
Airlines
gouvernement
are asking your government
les interdictions concernant les voyages internationaux. On a beaucoup
to
parlé de la
lift the
frontière
restrictions
avec
on
les
international
États-Unis,
travel.
prolongée jusqu'au 21 juillet.
We saw that the U.S. border agreement is extended to July 21st. But in terms of international travels, will you be going step by step? Will you allow travelers from certain countries to come in where the infection is not so serious? What are your plans in that regard? Well, what we've said from the very beginning is that the health and safety of Canadians is our top priority. Now, obviously, there are places in the world where the crisis is not as serious, but there are also places where it is still raging. So we will have to look very carefully at what we can do and when we can start to reopen our borders. Now, I understand that there are many tourism operators and airlines that would like us to be able to bring in tourists and allow people to come to Canada, but they must understand that if we move forward too quickly and if we're not absolutely certain of what we're doing at every step, we run the risk of getting into a second wave of infection, as we're seeing in certain places around the world, and having to reclose both our economy and put everyone back into lockdown. So we're going to move forward very gradually. We'll be following what's happening, and we'll look at what steps can be taken based on the international context as a whole, and doing everything we can to protect Canadians at every step.
I think there's a lot of tourist or operators, a lot of regions in the country, and companies like airlines that would very much like to see a return to international travel so we can get people coming in here and supporting our local communities and seeing business travel pick up again. But every step of the way, as we look at those next steps, we need to make sure we are keeping Canadians safe first and foremost. I understand how difficult this is and how frustrating this is for some people, but we know that reopening too quickly or carelessly would lead us to a resurgence that might well force us to go back into lockdown, to shut down the economy once again, and nobody wants that. That's why we have significant supports out for industries, for businesses, large and small, and for Canadians to be able to make it through the coming months. But we are going to be very, very careful about when and how we start reopening international borders.
En suivi, Mélanie?
Follow-up?
Oui, sur un autre sujet maintenant,
Yes, on another topic.
Michael Kovrig et Michael Spavor
Michael
en Chine. Il y a M.
Kovrig
Pompeo,
and,
le secrétaire
Spavor.
d'État américain Pompeo, qui a fait
Now, the
une
United
sortie qui a
States
réclamé leur
Secretary of State
libération.
has called for their
La
immediate
dernière fois, c'est pas la
release.
première fois qu'il le fait. La dernière fois, ça n'avait pas
The
fonctionné.
last time he did that,
Mais pour
nothing
les deux
happened.
Michael en Chine, qui
Now,
ont
for
eu
the
des
two
visites
Michaels
consulaires
in
depuis le mois
China,
de mai en Chine,
they have not received
avez-vous,
consular
à tout le moins,
assistance
réussi
since
à
May.
obtenir
Will you
des,
at least be able to
assouplissements de leur,
secure some
conditions de
relaxation
libération?
of their conditions?
L'ambassadeur Barton,
And what exactly has Ambassador Barton been able to do? First of all, I want to begin by thanking not only the United States, but our other allies and friends around the world who have strongly expressed their solidarity with Canada and their condemnation of the arbitrary detention of these two Canadians. It's a real shame to see China continue to punish Canadians for a decision that comes out of our independent judicial system involving Ms. Meng, and we will continue to push for more consular access and also to see the return of these two Canadians to Canada. It's a very difficult situation for them and for their families, but it's also a very troubling situation for all Canadians to see what China continues to do to these two citizens.
I'd like to begin by thanking yet again so many of our friends and steadfast allies around the world for speaking up and condemning China for the arbitrary detention of two Canadian citizens. From the very beginning, Chinese authorities have made a direct link between the detention of these two Canadians with the judicial process underway in the case of their citizen, Madame Meng. We obviously have a fully independent judicial system that will continue along its way, and we condemn the arbitrary detention of these two Canadian citizens. We continue to push for more and better consular access and conditions for them, but ultimately we continue to press and act in ways that will eventually get them home safe to their families.
Thank you. Operator, next question on the phone.
Next question is from Mia Robson, the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I'm curious, when it comes to China, the government is saying that your comments last week linking the case against Meng to the case against the Canadians are irresponsible, and that there are no links between the two cases. What makes you so sure that there are links between the two, and what do you say to the Chinese calling your comments irresponsible?
Within the very first few days of the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, Chinese officials were highlighting a link between the detention a week before of Madame Meng and the arrest of the two Michaels. It has been obvious from the beginning that this was a political decision made by the Chinese government, and we deplore it and have from the very beginning. We will continue to advocate strongly and firmly for the release of these two Canadians who've been arbitrarily detained. And again, we want to thank all of our friends and allies around the world who've consistently and continually stepped up to highlight that this arbitrary detention of Canadian citizens is unacceptable and deeply concerning, not just to Canadians, but to people around the world who see China using arbitrary detentions as a means to political ends, which is absolutely unacceptable, and we will continue to stand strong and united around the world against this choice of actions by China. Okay. Depuis les débuts,
from the very beginning, we saw that the Chinese authorities made a connection between the arrest of Ms. Meng and the detention of those two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. We obviously deplore the fact
nous avons un système judiciaire tout à fait indépendant d'interférences politiques et elle poursuit son cours dans le cas de Mme Meng. Alors, c'est avec grand plaisir qu'on voit que nos alliés autour de la planète continuent de parler haut et fort pour condamner ces actions des Chinois qui ont arrêté 2 Canadiens pour des raisons purement politiques. Nous allons continuer de faire tout ce qui est nécessaire pour assurer leur retour, tout en respectant la règle de droit dans le cas de notre système judiciaire.
Following up, Mia.
Yeah, when it comes to Huawei and Canada's 5G network, is Canada actually going to make a decision about whether or not Huawei will be allowed to operate in Canada for 5G? And why is it taking Canada so much longer than the other Five Eyes partners?
We continue to work with our intelligence agencies and security officials who continue to engage with our Five Eyes partners and allies around the world on the best way to move forward for the future of 5G in Canada. We will continue to make our decisions based on science and recommendations by those experts, and we're continuing to do our work on that. Okay. Nous allons continuer de travailler avec nos experts dans nos services de renseignement et nos services
in our security and intelligence agencies and follow their recommendations as to how we can ensure the security of our 5G system. We, of course, are working with our allies as well right around the world, and we will be making a decision on that at the appropriate time.
Last question over the phone.
Next question, Brian Lee, the Toronto Sun, line open.
Prime Minister, I'd like to go back to the reaction from China and the comments from the ministry spokesman, Mr. Zhao, saying that you should earnestly respect the spirit of the rule of law. Do you think that China actively follows the rule of law in cases like Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor?
We saw in the very first days after the detention of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, Chinese officials highlight that there is an obvious link between the case of Madame Meng in Vancouver being arrested on extradition in our extradition treaty and the detention of 2 Canadians on security charges. They made those links from the very beginning and continue to put political pressure on Canada through that detention, which is something that not just we deplore, but countries around the world are speaking up to deplore, because this using of arbitrary detentions as a means to advance political gains is something that is fully unacceptable in a world based on rules, and we will continue to stand up strongly for our values and our principles. Okay.
As soon as the 2 Canadians were arrested, the 2 that are now detained in China, the Chinese authorities highlighted the fact that there was a connection between their case and the case of Ms. Wang, who was arrested a couple of days earlier as part of an extradition request from the United States. So we have said that this is not acceptable for China to use mechanisms like an arrest to achieve their political means. And we have allies around the world who have shown themselves to be very concerned about the fate of these 2 Canadians, because they know that this could very well happen to them at some point. We have to show solidarity against these arbitrary decisions.
From the beginning of this, China has used a pile of tactics that could be described as bully tactics. In addition to kidnapping Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, they've also engaged in economic warfare with Canada, targeting various industries. Have you raised this with Chinese officials? Publicly, you have been reluctant to call out China to the same level as the Chinese have called out you and Canadian media and others. Have you raised this with them, and have you been outspoken enough when it comes to dealing with the aggressive stance and nature of how China has handled this?
We've continued to stand up for Canadian interests and Canadian values every step of the way. In every conversation with Chinese officials going back 5 years, we have always raised human rights issues. We've always raised concerns we have around China's engagement both regionally and with Canada and in the world, and we will continue to do that. We understand that as the world's second largest economy, they have a significant amount of economic might and levers, but Canada will continue to stand strong to support our farmers, to support our producers, while at the same time defending the interests of Canadians abroad and in detention in China. Okay.
From the very beginning, Canada has always clearly and strongly expressed its concern about human rights in China and elsewhere in the world, and we will continue to do that. We have also highlighted just how important it is to reflect Canadian values, even when you're dealing with the largest or the second largest economy in the world, and we expect Canadians to be treated properly, and we will be there to defend our farmers and producers and all Canadians in difficulty. Radio-Canada, I have a question about the CERB. Some people got a nasty surprise when they received a message from CRA saying, you're not entitled to the CERB this month because at the beginning there were 2 checks that were sent to you. There's a lot of confusion out there, and some people are now finding they're without a CERB check, even though they need it in order to pay for their rent, their groceries and other expenses. What do you say to those people? All Canadians who received the CERB received their $2,000 a month. So up until now, it's been $8,000 for the 4 months that it was in place, and we will be extending the CERB for an additional 2 months. Now, I understand there are situations where people received the money earlier because they needed it, and it created a bit of a challenge for them now. But we are looking at how we can help them. But as I say, this is a situation that is difficult for a number of families, and we're looking at that closely. Now, on China, you say that you're defending Canadian values, but that apparently has yielded no result. The 2 Michaels are still in China. China is not changing its position at all. Will you change and stop saying you're defending Canadian values and show that you're doing that and take decisions that prove that? Our primary concern is always Canadian interests and protecting Canadian citizens, the release of Canadian citizens, and the defense of our values and interests. In order to do that, we use a variety of means. There are things we do and say publicly, and there are other things we do in the background. And right now, we are working very hard to ensure that everything can be done to have those 2 Canadians released. And we will continue to do that because, as we've seen over the years, we succeeded a number of times in bringing Canadians home who had been detained unfairly and with something that we disagreed with. And we will use that experience to help the 2 Michaels as well.
David Aiken, Global News, Prime Minister. There are Liberal members of your party in this country, former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley among them, who say you should trade Hmong for the 2 Michaels, that there is a process, that your Justice Minister Lametti will get a chance in the process to have some input and make a decision. And if Hmong goes through the process and goes to the States or is released, you lose all leverage. And again, this is, I'm using Mr. Manley's words, you should do what you have to do. This is hardball politics and we should trade up. Are you at all considering that sort of thing? Because clearly the Chinese think there's still a quid pro quo that could happen here.
No, we're not considering that. Canada has a strong and independent justice system. We will ensure that it goes through its proper forces, and anyone who's considering weakening our values or weakening the independence of our justice system doesn't understand the importance of standing strong on our principles and our values. Okay. No, nous ne considérons pas faire de
No, we will
deal
not consider
à
making a
l'arrière-plan
deal
en ne pas respectant
behind the
notre système de
scenes
justice.
and not
On a un système de
respect
justice
our judicial system.
indépendant et fort,
We have a
et nous
strong,
allons,
independent judicial system,
rester
and
dans le respect de ce
we
système
continue
à chaque
to
fois,
respect
parce que
that
c'est ce à
system
quoi
every
les Canadiens
time, because
s'attendent,
that's what
et
Canadians
c'est ce
expect
qui
us
nous
to do.
protège dans le
And
monde
that's
aussi.
what allows us to protect ourselves around the world.
UNSC vote. One of the things we heard leading into it was one of the values of having that seat was that our ambassador, Ambassador Blanchard, would be basically every day talking to the Chinese ambassador, possibly the two Michaels. That obviously is not going to happen. Does that set back your ability to talk to senior Chinese diplomats? And I just wonder, too, if you could say whether or not the loss last week will spark a broader reset of Canadian foreign policy.
Obviously, over the past years, we have continually been engaging with countries around the world, including China, on defending Canada's interests, on standing up for our values, and we will continue to. As I said many times, a Security Council seat was a means to continue to have Canada's voice present on the world stage, but not having that seat certainly doesn't slow us down in everything that we have been doing and will continue to do on the world stage. It is going to be extremely important, particularly through this time of COVID-19, that we look for global solutions, that we strengthen multilateralism and the partnerships we've built with countries in Africa, countries in the Caribbean and South America in particular, on responding to this crisis and looking to what a better world could look like is something we will continue to do. And yes, reflect very carefully on how Canada can best continue to make sure that the solutions we're putting forward are resonating properly and helping on the world stage. I
think it's been clear for a number of years that we are engaged diplomatically with every country in the world, including China, and that will continue. The seat on the UN Security Council was an additional means of ensuring our voice would be heard on the international stage, but all the means available to us now will continue to be there, and therefore we will continue to have an impact. Our partnership in Africa and in the Caribbean and South and Central America will be very, very important in the era of COVID-19, but also as we rebuild and transform our world for the better. Multilateralism, working together, will both be very important in the interests of Canadians, but also to create a more prosperous and better world for all.
Given what you were describing, that we have two Canadian citizens who have been unjustly detained for closing in on 600 days now in China with no consular services. They're tortured by light torture and not ever shutting off the lights where they live. Why are you only going so far as to say you are disappointed in that?
I have highlighted from the very beginning our deep level of concern and disagreement with the arbitrary detention of two Canadians. We have expressed both publicly and privately how firm we are on wanting to get them back, and we continue to stand up both for the independence of our judicial system and Canadian interests and values. We work behind the scenes and in public to ensure that everyone understands that we will continue to work extremely hard to get these Canadians home.
I've always been very clear that we denounce China's decision to arbitrarily detain these two Canadians for political reasons, and we will continue to push for their return to Canada. And we deplore China's decision to play political games on this.
We've learned that your government's received a legal opinion that the Justice Minister can intervene in the case of Meng Wanzhou. Michael Kovrig's family says that David Lametti actually saw it about a month ago. It was submitted about a month ago. I'd like to get your response to this legal opinion.
Obviously, there are tools in a government that exist that sometimes haven't been used in a very, very long time. We are proceeding in a way that defends and upholds the independence of our judicial system, and we will not interfere politically in the unfolding of our rigorous independent justice system.
There are always tools on paper that have not been used for a long time or perhaps never before, and they are theoretically available, but we have clearly stated that we will not intervene politically in our judicial system.
Hello, Prime Minister. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver with CTV National News. Your government has recently made a deal with Mexico to better protect migrant workers, but this deal comes too late for 3 migrant workers who have now died of COVID-19 and hundreds of others who are battling the virus in poor accommodations. Do you feel that the Canadian government has failed these workers?
We brought in strong measures around mandatory quarantines for arriving temporary foreign workers and have rules in place that protect those workers. Obviously, there are cases in which those rules were not followed, and we are extremely concerned by that, and there will be consequences for companies that did not follow the rules designed to protect workers in Canada. In Canada, anyone doing work, let alone essential work as part of our food chain, needs to feel protected. Obviously, in the case of these 3 tragic deaths, that wasn't the case, and we are ensuring that changes are made and that there will be consequences. Évidemment, quiconque travaille au Canada,
whoever works in Canada deserves to be able to do that in a safe and secure environment. But the rules were not followed in the case of these 3 Mexican citizens, these 3 workers. Now, we did introduce measures to ensure there would be a proper quarantine period and protective measures for workers. However, some people violated the rules with respect to distancing and work conditions. So we are looking at exactly what occurred, but there certainly will be consequences, and we will have to ensure the system changes to help the most vulnerable.
Followed closely enough, and that your government is going to try to do more to change the situation. But why is the government continuing to allow migrants in right now when doing so jeopardizes their health? And what concrete steps is your government going to take, and will that include hiring more inspectors, and if so, how many?
There are many facilities across the country that employ temporary foreign workers in which there are no cases, where people are doing important and good work to contribute to our supply chain in essential ways that keep Canadians fed. We recognize there are a number of places where those rules and those protocols haven't been adequately followed, and we will ensure that there are consequences, while at the same time recognizing the important work brought by these temporary workers to the Canadian economy and to Canadians themselves. There
are many places around the country where we have temporary workers who are in safe and secure conditions, who are doing good work and contributing to providing food to Canadians, and that has to continue. But in cases where we saw outbreaks, we have to look carefully at the circumstances and understand what happened and whether there need to be consequences.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui m'a fait la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui.
All right, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Monday, giving his almost daily briefing on COVID-19, although the vast majority of questions today had to do with China and the ongoing detention and now charging of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. You heard the Prime Minister there ask a question about whether Canada would consider striking a deal with China to release Meng Wanzhou in order to exchange both of the Michaels, and he was very definitive and said, no, we are not considering that. I'll bring in the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelis, and the CBC's David Cochrane. I think we'll talk about China and then the migrant workers if we can. So let's start with China, because there were, obviously this follows some tough talk from China today, saying that the Prime Minister's remarks on Friday were irresponsible, Vashi.
Yeah, the remarks on Friday basically saying that this is the arbitrary detention of 2 Canadians and that it is tied to what happened with Meng Wanzhou, who is, of course, the CFO of Huawei, a huge Chinese telecom company, which Canada just happens to be considering the question of whether or not Huawei enters the 5G network here. Anyway, he called it arbitrary, as he had a number of times, and you're absolutely right. It was characterized by Chinese officials today, or very early today, as irresponsible. They said the remarks were irresponsible, and that was put to the Prime Minister many times during this press conference. A wide variety of questions on China, but most of them saying, are you going to say more than you're disappointed by this? Have you said more behind the scenes? And in particular, I thought the answer that was the most interesting, as you point out, Rosie, was the question around John Manley, who is well known in this country, former Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. He has been interviewed a number of times about China. He also used to occupy a role here in Canada where he oversees a number of the biggest companies, sort of represents a number of the biggest companies on the public scene, the Canadian Council of Business. And he has been asked, what to do in this situation, what his thoughts are. And he has, and I'm paraphrasing here, but much like others, like John McCallum even in the past, surmised about the possibility of, just giving up Meng Wanzhou in exchange for those two men, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. Or if that's what it's going to take, which it very much appears from everything we've heard from China, the release of Meng Wanzhou, then that is something Canada should consider if it meant getting back Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And that specifically is what our colleague David Aiken over at Global News put to the Prime Minister, and I thought got the most definitive response out of him. He said, no, we are not considering that. And in fact, he said that suggesting that or considering that is akin to weakening our values or our principles, and that is not something that he or his government is prepared to do. The follow-up question from our colleague Tom Perry was also very interesting in that there is a legal opinion, and it's kind of procedural because it's playing out in the courts, but because it's it's about extradition, there is a point at which the federal justice minister is able to sort of either sign off or not on what ends up being decided. And Tom put to the Prime Minister that there is a legal opinion that the justice minister is in receipt of. I think he said the timeline was about a month, which says he can intervene. And whether or not that is being considered or that is something that might happen. And again, the Prime Minister was less definitive than he was to David, but he certainly did not give any indication that there is even the most remote possibility this government somehow gets involved before the court process plays out. I don't think anyone in the government has ruled out the final decision, sort of that sign-off, yes or no, of there being some sort of involvement of the federal government. But in that process, which could be years, by the way, in which this extradition hearing plays out in the courts, it sounds to me like there is no intention on the part of the Prime Minister or anyone in government to do what is akin to something that Mr. Manley had suggested or what this legal opinion offers them the right to do, which I think there's the possibility of interesting fallout from that. How is that perceived by the Chinese? And certainly at the core of all of this, the context to all of this is that these two gentlemen, I think on Friday, it had been 557 days during which they have been detained. And since the pandemic broke, I think since January, actually, they've had no consular access as well. So even though the federal government continues to ask for virtual consular access, they have been denied that so far as well.
Yeah, and obviously, so a couple things. The legal opinion that Tom was talking about was prepared by, amongst other people, former Chief Justice Louise Arbour, that would, I guess, put the parameters around how the government could make that defense, that releasing Meng Wanzhou back to China, not following through or coming to the end of the extradition process and making that decision would work. And I would have guessed, David, that if the government's line, for lack of a better word, from the beginning has been this is an independent trial, this is an independent justice system, we must let things play out. If that's been the line to China from the beginning, it would be difficult to dial that back in any way, I suppose.
Yeah. Look, I have not seen this legal opinion, and I am not a lawyer, but I'm not even remotely surprised that a legal opinion would conclude that the government can interfere, because that is how extradition works. The final decision on extradition after the court process goes to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General's desk for a yay or nay decision by the minister. I mean, as much as this is a legal system around extradition, it is really an instrument of diplomacy, and it's a political decision as to whether or not to send someone abroad to face trial for criminal charges in another country. So the way it works, though, in practice, Rosie, is that this is the full authority of the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, but it operates as a designated authority. The decisions to charge and arrest are designated to the bureaucracy. There's a specialized group inside the Department of Justice called the International Assistance Group, which is a group of lawyers who work on mutual assistance treaties and extradition treaties with foreign countries. And that's where the requests are made to arrest someone like Meng Wanzhou when a country like the United States is seeking to put her on trial. Now, the minister and stuff would be informed of what is going on, but the practice has been to designate those decisions to government lawyers to take politics out of it right until the final decision ends up on the minister's desk. Now, that practice does not preclude them from getting involved, but as you heard the Prime Minister say today, we're absolutely not talking about a prisoner swap. This isn't the Bridge of Spies during the Cold War. He said that in January in Winnipeg when we were there for the cabinet retreat, and he was asked about this directly as well, that we are going to let the legal process play out. So what he's essentially said there today, in slightly different language, I think we've heard before, that essentially China is using arrest to exert political pressure, trying to achieve its political objectives through pseudo-judicial ones by arresting Canadians. So the situation this leaves you in is the Prime Minister is not escalating the rhetoric in a meaningful way. He was asked about this, why are you just saying you're disappointed? Because I guess the language of politics and the language of diplomacy are two very different things. He's not escalating the language, though China has escalated its actions, right? Moving it from the detention phase to the charge phase. And the statistics show us that when someone moves to that phase, there's like a 99% probability of conviction and then sentencing. So it's a dubious future for the two Michaels ahead. But this whole idea of exchanging them, as people like John Manley have been expressing, and even Jean Chrétien has suggested in some way, has deeply frustrated the Liberals I speak with. If you go back to one of the first foreign policy positions the Trudeau government took at its first G7 in Tokyo, I think in 2016 in Ise-shima in Japan, was not to pay ransom for hostage takings, because it's their belief with terrorist organizations that if Canada becomes known as a country that pays ransoms, it puts a target on every Canadian abroad as a potential source of revenue for a criminal organization. If you start doing things like this, trading Meng Wanzhou for Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the next time there's something unpopular with China, what's to stop them from doing a similar tactic again if they know this one works? It's a terrible situation for the Michaels. It's also a terrible situation for Canada.
I would say two comments before we talk about migrant workers. I do think, and this is the second time now the Prime Minister has said it, that we do things publicly, but we also do things in the background. He said that also on Friday. It stood out for me because we don't exactly know what that entails, but certainly the government has come under intense criticism from various corners about whether the language and the actions are aggressive enough. And I would just say this on Mr. Manley's comments, which obviously seemed to frustrate the Prime Minister, I think is fair to say, that he said back in December that he realized it wasn't a popular thing to say in Ottawa these days, but arresting Madame Meng was a mistake. I would point out that Mr. Manley is a director at TELUS Communications in Canada. TELUS Communications uses equipment from Huawei, and of course that might be important to remember in this instance. Okay, let's think about the migrant workers now. News of a third death on the weekend of a 55-year-old man. So there are 3 migrant workers that have died, and we're going to talk to someone in just a moment. But wanted to get you both to weigh in on that as well, because obviously, the admission from the Prime Minister that something was not done right here, that it was, that I don't know if he said rules were broken.
He wants to make sure the rules are followed, and that it appears they haven't been.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
Yeah, the same thing stuck out to me, Rosie, as well, because I've done a number of interviews the past few weeks about this. 3 migrant workers have now passed away. Windsor, for example, I think the announcement was just made that they're being held back from moving into the next stage of reopening, primarily because of the outbreaks in communities in which migrant workers work right now in the Windsor area. This third worker who passed away, and I'm so sorry, I don't have the name of his name on the tip of my tongue, but you had it earlier, Rosie.
Chaparro, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. He worked near Simcoe, so not in the Windsor area, but there have been a lot of conversations between, for example, public health officials in the Windsor area, the mayor of Windsor, a lot of concern from, of course, advocate groups around this as well. And so far, the government, until Mexico said that they were no longer going to send any, they're putting a pause basically on sending any temporary foreign workers here. There certainly wasn't a huge amount of acknowledgement from the federal government that something had gone really wrong with the processes that were in place. To be fair to the feds, they did put up a lot of money. I think it was about $50 to $60 million to enable people to properly self-quarantine when they had to and to isolate themselves. I think it was $1,500 per employee wherever the employer had the necessity to quarantine people. So there was a lot of money allotted to that. But the big complaint I heard, especially from advocate groups, was around inspections. And that's why these comments from the Prime Minister really stuck out to me around the rules not being adequately followed. My understanding is a majority of those inspections, and there have been more than 500, as of a few weeks ago, more than 500, were conducted virtually. So there was a lot of concern from the workers and from the advocate groups about the efficacy or the accuracy of those inspections. Of more than 500 inspections that were completed, zero they call them non-compliances, but basically no employer was found to be breaking the rules. There were zero there's a possibility of punishment, but no penalties were levied. No one was found to be in non-compliance, was exactly, I think, how the Minister of Immigration put it to me at the time. That is again, very interesting to me, because if the problem is about not following the rules and you're not showing in your inspections that anyone isn't following the rules, which is, by the way, what these workers were flagging to the advocacy groups at the time, then there seems to me to be a problem with the inspection process. So my follow-up questions for the government are certainly, what are you going to do to boost the accuracy and the depth to which these inspections take place? And do you acknowledge that the ones that have been conducted so far don't meet the standards that you need to have going forward in order to kind of make good on this promise to ensure that everyone is following the rules and to really mitigate the spread of the virus or lessen it? Because, as we've seen, that these communities are being hit really hard. And there's a host of other questions, a lot about permanent residency and the way in which these workers are treated in the first place. But I think zeroing in on the idea of ensuring better compliance with the rules certainly, I think, generates some questions about the process that's currently in place.
And where this last gentleman, Mr. Chaparro, died, there are more than 200 positive cases in that area, in that farming operation. So obviously, obviously the measures aren't in place to make sure that people are well protected, David.
Yeah, virtual inspections. We also saw another trouble spot in this country inspected remotely, and that was long-term care homes in Ontario. As our colleague David Common and his team reported, a lot of long-term care homes were inspected over the phone rather than in person. So you may be able to telecommute. It is very difficult to tele-inspect, especially critical things such as seniors care and food production. And when the Prime Minister said that rules weren't followed on things like work conditions and living conditions, not followed by who? Not followed by the workers, not followed by the employer, not followed by both. Will there be accountability for these particular failures? It's interesting, too. It reminds me a little bit of the meat packing and the meat processing story that we saw in places like Alberta, where it's similar things, right? People pack together in a contained space to work, and then often living in a communal living situation where there's a lot of people in really a smaller than desirable space at the best of times, and certainly during the time of a respiratory viral pandemic. So I'm curious to see how they change that. There was money provided, as Vashi outlined, up front for people to self-isolate and people to quarantine and people to do these things. And there's a need to put resources at this to make sure it's done right because of the dependency, obviously, we have on our domestic food supply in a time of global trade disruption. But what do they do now? I mean, do they provide extra housing? Do they provide extra inspections? Right. The numbers are quite high. If you look at it, it's bigger than some Atlantic provinces, for example, just in some of these places. So the next steps are going to be vital on this too.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. I'll come back to you if you don't mind. Let me go now, though, to Karen Koch. She's the Projects and Campaigns Coordinator for Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, an organization that fights for justice and dignity for migrant workers. And Karen has spoken to the families of the workers who have died from COVID-19. Karen, thanks for making the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rosemary.
So I don't know if you've spoken to Mr. Chaparro's family. I know he's left behind a wife and 4 kids. Maybe you can just give me a sense of how they're doing.
Yeah, I have been in contact with the family. They are, as to be expected, totally devastated. They are grieving. They are in shock. Mr. Chaparro had been ill for some time and had not been able to be in contact with his family in recent days. And they are shocked that someone who had been coming to Canada for 10 years to work, to provide income as the main breadwinner for their family, will not be returning home this season alive.
Yeah, I mean, it's devastating to have 3 deaths, but hundreds and hundreds of cases. We heard the Prime Minister, Karen, talk about how rules weren't followed, and you maybe heard Vashi there talk about virtual inspections. Is anything being done to mitigate the spread of the pandemic? Because it does seem to be sort of spinning out of control on about 17 Canadian farms at this stage.
I think we've heard a lot about the housing conditions and the working conditions on farms for migrant farm workers and how they really provoked the massive spreading like wildfire of this disease on farms. But on the question of rules, I think we need to be very clear that the vast majority of the housing and working conditions that migrant workers on farms are living and working under are actually perfectly legal. The problem is not that people are not following the rules. The problem is that the rules are bad. Workers told us before they even arrived in Canada when COVID-19 hit that they were afraid to come to Canada to work because they knew that their housing and working conditions would put them at extreme risk of exposure and of illness and possibly death. And they know, migrant workers know, that they cannot raise concerns about their housing and working conditions without risking termination, which means they risk all of their income, which means they risk deportation and potential blacklisting from the program and returning to Canada in future. This is because workers do not have permanent status in this country. And so anytime they raise concerns about their working and living conditions, they can be deported. And workers, every single worker that we have spoken to at farms where there are outbreaks, have said to us from the get-go, they know that they cannot speak up about conditions that they knew would put them at risk, about the lack of PPE, about the crowded housing conditions, about the extreme overwork, because they know what happens to them. They get terminated, they get deported, and then they can't come back, and their families depend on this income. So the question is not whether or not rules are being followed. The question is that the program is built to keep workers temporary, and that provides all of the power, that puts all of the power in the hands of employers and no power in the hands of workers to be able to protect themselves from preventable situations like what we are seeing right now.
So Mexico had, of course, suspended sending workers to Canada because it was concerned around this, and then I guess got some reassurances from the Employment Minister, Carla Qualtrough, from the government around things that the federal government would do to try and secure the conditions and make sure that these people are better protected. What do you make of that decision then to allow workers to come back and the federal government's commitment to try and do better?
Well, we've heard nothing from the Canadian government about the question of permanent residency, and we know that that fundamentally is the problem here. Workers know that that is the problem here, which is why workers have been demanding permanent residency for years now, to be able to address their inability to raise concerns about bad living and working conditions and leave bad jobs. And we know that the agreement that the Mexican and the Canadian government came to has said things about doing more inspections, it has access to workers to complain. But fundamentally, if workers do not have the stability and the security to be able to stay in this country and continue to work, they will not be able to effectively raise concerns about bad living and working conditions. And employers will continue to have a green light to ensure that workers are producing the maximum amount of output in the minimum number of conditions with the worst working conditions.
I get that might be the long-term outcome, but given that isn't going to happen overnight, is there anything short-term that could be done to better protect people, in your view? Better housing, giving them hotel rooms, I don't know, something that's obviously not going to resolve the problem but could help.
I mean, it actually is a short-term solution. We've seen that the Canadian government responded to the issue of asylum seekers working in healthcare in Quebec who are being exposed to COVID-19 to provide a pathway to permanent residency. We are saying that actually immediate permanent residency for migrant workers is the fastest and the most effective way to be able to provide workers the ability to protect themselves, to denounce bad working conditions and living conditions, put pressure on employers to improve the kinds of jobs that they provide and leave those bad jobs. Access to better housing, access to better health care, all of these things are vitally important in this situation, but they do not address the fundamental problem that workers simply do not have the power and do not have the choice to protect themselves or to access any of those better conditions so long as they can be deported at a moment's notice for having done so.
The workers that you're talking to, the ones that are still going to work every day for the reasons that you've outlined there, how concerned are they that they're going to get sick? Because clearly hundreds have gotten sick.
They are very concerned. They are very concerned for their health. They are concerned for what happens to their families as the breadwinners if they get sick and can't work. They are concerned about the money that they have lost by having to be in quarantine. They are very concerned and they are devastated by these deaths. Workers are devastated by these deaths. These are their coworkers. These are people they shared bunkhouses with. They are devastated and they are very afraid. And they know that their employer has complete power over them and that there is nothing that they can do to change their circumstances until the government gives them access to the power to be able to do so. And so people are going back to work very afraid, knowing that this added scrutiny on farms is making employers scrutinize workers even more. So it's actually exacerbating the power imbalances that exist and making it even more difficult for workers to raise concerns about what's going on.
Okay, Karen Koch, thank you for making the time on this, such an important topic, appreciate it. Karen Koch is the Projects and Campaigns Coordinator for Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. Should tell you that Canadian farmers rely on about 60,000 short-term farm workers, mostly from Latin America and Caribbean countries, to come in and help with the planting and harvesting in this country. So again, as we've seen sort of with long-term care centers, we've seen it again as David was talking about, meat processing plants, and now in many, many farms in southern Ontario and elsewhere, something around how the system is sort of exposing itself and probably needs to be addressed with some long-term changes as well. We are standing by to bring you a press conference from the President of the Treasury Board, who will talk a little bit, we are expecting, about the public services return to work, which isn't happening anytime soon, but there is now some parameters set up around that. Also, we'll hear from public health officials. And then at 12:20, we will take you here, and that's the Governor of the Bank of Canada. The new Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, has given a speech at the Canadian Club, and he's going to take some questions from reporters. But he did say in his speech earlier that the recovery, the economic recovery, will be, quote, prolonged and bumpy, which of course would be expected. But it'll be interesting to hear the Governor's thoughts on the future of that recovery, the future of interest rates, which he has said aren't going to move anytime soon either. As we wait for all of that to begin, though, let me bring in another guest. Dr. Jennifer Kwan is a family physician in Burlington, Ontario, and she's part of Masks for Canada, a group that's advocating for mandatory face masks. Dr. Kwan says masks should be mandatory in all indoor spaces outside of your home, as well as crowded places and public transit. Doctor, thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to see you. Okay, so this is, I guess it's a group now of mostly doctors, but other scientists and advocates saying that masks really need to be mandatory. We've seen in some places, Ottawa Public Transit, for instance, Toronto says you have to wear them on public transit. But what exactly are you saying needs to happen with masks in this country?
So we think masks should be mandatory in high-risk settings, which is what you've listed in the ACT acronym: all indoor public spaces, crowds where you cannot distance from others, and transit, including public transportation. So we do make exceptions for anyone who has a medical condition who cannot wear a mask. They should not have to wear one for young children as well. And also, we are advising to avoid any fines or criminal penalties. We want this to be an educational experience to help Canadians understand that masks are important for both health and for economic recovery.
What kind of difference do you think a mandatory mask wearing in those conditions you've set out there would make for controlling the virus?
So right now, the latest leisure poll has showed that about 48% of Canadians wear masks. We need to get to approximately 80% so that it can significantly impact the transmission of COVID-19. This will help ensure that our reopening is safe and sustainable.
I have to say I was out and about a little bit on the weekend, and I am wearing a mask when I go into stores, but there were lots of people not wearing them. And I wonder if it's because people, well, I'm wondering why you think that might be. Is it because people aren't convinced masks work, because they think that they can do the 2 meters and not worry? What is your understanding about why people just aren't doing it?
So the weather has been really nice lately, so it might lead us to let our guard down, especially when the reopening is happening. There's also been initially a lot of mixed messaging about masks, but now the general consensus is yes, masks do work, and you should wear one if you're able to.
So where would you want this directive to come from? From public health officials, provincially and federally? Just start wearing them in a required way immediately?
Well, I think the federal government has said it would be up to the provinces, and I just want somebody to make that decision and ensure consistency, because there has been some individual public health units that have done it, but there needs to be consistency, whether it's all transportation systems or even if they can set parameters for regions to decide if there's X number of cases and there's disease prevalence, then we should have mandatory masking.
What about the enforcement, though? You said obviously you don't want criminal fines or anyone chasing anyone down the street because they're not wearing a mask, but it does seem like even in transit, that is a difficult thing to enforce. It's difficult onus to put on people at stores or on public transit, that they are the ones that have to tell someone to do this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that right now, if certain stores or regions do this and it's not consistent, then it puts a lot of onus on the store owner to enforce it. So if it's a consistent thing province-wide, that would be very helpful. And certainly stores who have these policies, if they could accommodate people who cannot wear masks with personal shoppers or curbside pickup, or provide masks for people who don't have access, that would also help everybody.
Just remind Canadians again why you believe wearing a mask is important, and why public health officials right now say that if you can't get your physical distancing, you should be wearing one. So just remind people why that matters.
Yeah, certainly COVID-19 is a respiratory virus that's transmitted from someone's mouth and nose to another person's mouth and nose. So having a mask which covers the mouth and nose is very helpful for catching droplets from your mouth and preventing spread of the virus. So approximately 45% of COVID cases can be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So that means you might not know you're infected. So if everybody can wear a mask if they're able to, that will really reduce transmission.
Yeah, you're not protecting yourself, you're protecting the people around you. Just a final question, Dr. Kwan, what has been the response to this?
From general Canadians?
Well, from anyone. What's been from anyone?
Yeah, I think initially maybe it was a little bit confusing to hear all the mixed messages, but I really believe Canadians, are altruistic, we care about one another, we're polite. So masks really are a polite Canadian thing to do, and it's starting to become, cool and fashionable, and it really shows you care for other people and you want to get the economy back on track. So I really encourage everyone to wear a mask if they can.
Okay, Dr. Kwan, thank you for making the time. I do appreciate it very much. That's Dr. Jennifer Kwan.
Thank you.
She's a family physician in Burlington, Ontario. Thank you, Doctor. Okay, I will, as we stand by and wait for this press conference from federal public health officials and the President of the Treasury Board, I'll bring back my colleagues, Vashi Kapelis, the host of Power and Politics, and the CBC's David Cochrane in our Parliamentary Bureau. Bit of a different day. I should tell people that the COVID-19 committee is not meeting anymore in the House of Commons. They're not returning until July 8th now, and that's, of course, when the government will also give us this fiscal economic snapshot, as they're calling it. So it's not quite as busy as it had been in the nation's capital. I'm not sure if that's a sign that things are going to slow down or that the Prime Minister is going to take some time off. I'm not sure. But there's still a lot on the go in terms of response to various things. Let's just circle back to China, if you don't mind, just because I do think it's sort of top of mind for a lot of people, given the events on Friday, and also given the reports in the book written by John Bolton that Canada was strongly suggested by the United States that it should go ahead with this extradition and arrest Meng Wanzhou. particularly given that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, today released a press release saying that the U.S. is still deeply concerned by China's decision to proceed with the charges against Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and goes on. And we heard the Prime Minister talking there about international support, Vashi, that this is, Washington is not the only administration that has spoken out. Others have too, though you have to wonder at what point does that help or hurt the case, or does it have any impact at all, really?
Yeah, well, that is certainly a question that I've had too. And most of the, for example, former ambassadors that we keep touching base with throughout all of this really do advocate for that as a strategy. So if anything will be successful, other than this prisoner swap, which obviously the government has said no to, it might be international pressure, on China, not just where this issue is concerned, but basically they have proven as a regime to be responsive to a change in the way that they're viewed by the international community. So in the past, that might have been the case. I'm not saying necessarily it will apply in this case, but it seems like from the conversations, at least that I have, that if Canada is to have a shot at swaying them one way or the other, that international pressure will be key. I think there's a secondary debate to be had about the strength of that pressure. Has it been enough? Will it be enough? Are countries as taken up by this cause as they could be or should be? And that will obviously impact the effectiveness of that as a strategy for sure. But I think overall as a strategy, most experts I speak to think this is the best way to go. So on your point, for example, of the Bolton book, the pages that we've been privy to were pretty fascinating, because the picture they paint is one where the president was willing to sort of trade the whole idea of Ms. Meng for the idea of a prisoner swap, or the idea of cutting a deal with China and making Ms. Meng part of it, was open to that concept, but it was maybe unsurprisingly, given their policy orientation, or their ideological orientation rather, in the past, Mr. Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who most ardently tried to convince Canadian officials, or tried to assure them that the United States would have our back. They would stand shoulder to shoulder with Canada and its government on this issue, and upholding the rule of law, and upholding the rule of law specifically in this case. I thought that was really fascinating. And then when I stepped back, I thought, okay, that's actually not that surprising either, because the president, right? The president has signaled openness to cutting deals on a variety of different subjects. Why would this one be any different? And when you do look at the ideological orientation of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, there is no surprise in a million years that they would want to see Ms. Meng face the full force of the law in this case. And so, Mike Pompeo's statement today, sure, I think it's great that they are saying things like that. I think there is a degree of questioning around the effectiveness of it at this point. But I do think also that if that chorus of international voices grows louder and grows stronger, short of that prisoner swap that the Prime Minister rather says he's not considering under any circumstances, it may be at this point, one of our best hopes.
Yeah, although, I mean, it's not like the United States and China have a good relationship, right?
No,
so, how do you build sort of a global public pressure on the issue to force China's hand? I don't know. And I know that that's sort of the criticism about the Prime Minister, too. If he starts using heavy language and drops the hammer, what's the impact of it? Obviously, people are smarter than I am about this, but I think those are some of the things that they're trying to consider, is at what point is there enough public pressure that China feels like it has to do something different. For now, though, the government is really sticking to the line that it's maintained from the beginning, that this is a justice process, and it will follow out in that way, and the government won't get involved, even if China says that they don't believe it to be true. Is Dr. Tam up yet? No, I'll go. Okay, I'll just let David have 30 seconds, and then I'll go to Dr. Tam.
Yeah, Rosie, I mean, we've seen statements from the U.S., we've seen statements from the G7. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary for the U.K., is out with another statement today, all expressing concern and disappointment. It doesn't seem to move the Chinese whatsoever. And a final point on the U.S., it's great to have Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, siding with Canada on this. But going back to this Bolton book, there is that revealing episode where the President of the United States sits down with President Xi of China and tries to get him to buy agricultural products from Midwest states to help him in his re-election by driving the economy there. So you have to wonder how strong a partner the United States is on dealing with China if Canada's interests collide with the re-election interests of Donald Trump.
Okay, we're going to take you, thank you both, we're going to take you to the government's officials' update on the response to COVID-19. I should tell you that we'll also then take you to the Governor of the Bank of Canada's press conference shortly. This is the Deputy Public Health Officer, Dr. Howard New.
By the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction found that 1 in 4 respondents aged 35 to 53 years had increased their alcohol use during the pandemic. For those aged between 18 to 34 years old, it's 1 in 5. The lack of a regular schedule, stress, and boredom were the most common reasons cited among respondents for increased drinking. Even more concerning are the results published last week by the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. More than 1 in 4 respondents aged 18 to 59 years indicated they had engaged in binge drinking during the past 7 days. These times are difficult, and it is normal to look for ways to cope with stress and uncertainty. There are, however, risks of increased alcohol use among Canadians during COVID-19. Drinking too much alcohol can lead to negative outcomes for Canadians and their families. For example, injury, motor vehicle accidents, violent crime, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and numerous chronic diseases like cancers and liver disease. During this difficult time, we encourage Canadians to consider alternative ways to cope with their stress, for example, regular physical activity, and we encourage them to consider the impacts of alcohol on their health. The best way to avoid short and longer term risks from alcohol is to not drink. However, if they choose to do so, they can consult Canada's low-risk alcohol drinking guidelines for strategies to help lower the risks. This resource offers information on standard drink sizes, recommended daily and weekly limits, and the website also offers information and reminders to reduce high-risk activities and exposures. If you have questions about your drinking, or if you would like information about where you can get support, we encourage you to speak with your healthcare provider. You can also find tips for taking care of your mental and physical health on the canada.ca/coronavirus website. You can also visit Wellness Together Canada online for a range of mental health and substance use supports at no cost. It is normal to feel fear, stress, and worry in a crisis. No one has to go through this alone. There are resources available to help us all get through this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. New. I would also like to take this opportunity to update Canadians on the easing of COVID-19 restrictions for public servants. Every industry and aspect of our economy has been affected by COVID-19, as have our interactions with others and how and where we work. Like many Canadians across the country, in mid-March, a large number of public servants had to trade their traditional work sites for dining room, kitchens, and bedroom offices. Since then, many of them have worked long hours in new, innovative ways, and often in difficult circumstances, or have also taken on new responsibilities. New services that would normally have taken many months to plan and execute were rolled out in a matter of days or weeks. Some examples include the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, also known as CERB, the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, and coordinating the largest repatriation effort of Canadians in Canadian history. Millions of Canadians were in need, and the speed at which these critical services were rolled out in unprecedented ways. We have now, by and large, however, entered a new phase. The growth curve of the disease is trending downwards. Provinces are, at varying paces, reopening their economies, and restrictions are gradually being eased. With that in mind, deputy heads have received guidance on how to respond to this easing of restrictions to support plans to increase access to federal workplaces. This guidance, which will continue to evolve, has been formulated as a result of consultations with bargaining agents and contribution from internal and external experts. Noting that health authorities have stated that physical distancing measures should remain, these plans will make provisions for the fact that many public servants will continue to work remotely for some time to come. Indeed, as plans unfold, the health and safety of employees will be an absolute priority for our government. Increasing access to federal work sites for employees and the public will be gradual, and timing will vary from organization to organization and from one location in Canada to the other, based on their unique situations. I want to stress that employees of every organization will be given reasonable notice and assurances about the safety measures that will apply before being asked to return to their worksite. In the meantime, as we build on the innovation seen in the last months, we will continue to leverage tools and technology to serve Canadians in more modern and efficient ways. The pandemic has shown how fast and nimble the public service can be, and just how important the public service is to Canadians. Amidst a global pandemic, Canada's public servants have worked tirelessly to serve Canadians. On behalf of all Canadians, I thank all public servants for their service to our country. I know that they will continue to serve our country with unwavering commitment and dedication. J'aimerais profiter de l'occasion cet après-midi pour une
I would like to give you an update on the easing of restrictions for public servants. All sectors and all different aspects of our economy were affected by COVID-19. This affected the way that we worked.
If you would like to continue watching
the places in
this
which
press
we
conference,
worked.
you can do so at CBC.ca. Just going to give you a little bit of news, too. If you live in Toronto and Peel region, you are moving into stage 2 of reopening on Wednesday, meaning you can go get your hair cut. Windsor and Essex remains in stage 1. We'll hear more about that from the Premier at the top of the hour. But let's go now to the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, who's speaking to reporters and taking questions on the recovery, the economic recovery moving forward after COVID-19. Let's listen in now.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Good morning, Governor. Kevin Gallagher here. The government is going to put out what is a partial snapshot of Canada's economic situation in this partial economic update. But how much of the lack of information and uncertainty makes it difficult to have real projections for you to do your work in managing the economy? How much of that is tied to the Canadian government being able to put forward things like a full fiscal update and a full federal budget?
Thank you. Look, the outlook is fraught with uncertainty. I don't think I need to underline that too many times. With respect to what we're planning to do on July 15th in our monetary policy report, as I've indicated, we will be publishing a central scenario. And just to tell you what we mean by a central scenario is going to look a lot like a forecast, but reflecting the fact that there is unprecedented levels of uncertainty, particularly around the evolution of the virus itself. We're calling it a central scenario to really underline that there's an unusual amount of uncertainty around it. With respect to the government's update, that will certainly be helpful. The government has already been very transparent on its spending with respect to the various emergency response measures it's taken to support households, to support businesses, to defer tax collections, to provide lending. And certainly those spending plans will be an important input into our outlook.
Next question is from
Just
Kim.
to follow up.
Sorry, Kevin, we don't have time for follow-up. If we have time, we'll come back to you. I've got to move on to Kim McCrail of Wall Street Journal is next.
Hi, thank you, Governor. You referred in this speech to the bank's asset purchase programs as becoming a source of monetary stimulus. Can you talk about when those shifted from easing strains in financial markets to providing stimulus, and how effective is quantitative easing in providing stimulus to the economy right now?
So the asset purchase programs were launched in a period when there were severe strains in funding markets, and their immediate goal, the imperative of a central bank, is to provide the liquidity that is needed to keep credit flowing. And that was really through March and April. As we've seen, as we've got into May and certainly now into June, we have seen a substantial improvement in market functioning. So some of our shorter term programs, BA program, for example, you're seeing us scale back that program. The repos are starting to roll off. At the same time, we have committed to continue buying Government of Canada bonds at a pace of at least $5 billion a week. And particularly with the improvements we've seen in funding markets and with the economy beginning to reopen, that will be an important source of stimulus. That is quantitative easing. That'll be an important source of stimulus. We've lowered the policy rate to the effective lower bound of 25 basis points at the short end, and the large-scale asset purchases are contributing to keeping interest rates low across the Government of Canada curve, and that is getting passed on to households and businesses. There is a considerable amount of monetary stimulus in place. If you look at more 5-year variable rate mortgages down about 80 basis points, prime rate down about 150 basis points. Rates across the government curve are at or very near historic lows, and if you look at real interest rates, by which I mean the nominal rate less expected inflation, those are negative across the entire curve.
Thank you. The next question is from Dave Parkinson, and he'll be followed by Shelley Hagan of Bloomberg and Kelsey Johnson of Reuters.
Good afternoon, Governor. Turned it afternoon while I was working. Just wanted to follow up on Kim's question a little bit. When you talk about those QE and CE functions of those bond programs, shifting to more of a monetary stimulus role, I'm wondering if you foresee that the bank will have to adjust those programs, rework them in some way to more specifically serve a monetary stimulus purpose as opposed to their initial market functioning purpose, if we are going to need to see a reworking, even an expansion of those programs in order to serve that new role more directly?
I think what I would stress is that while these programs were initiated to restore market functioning, as that has progressed and as that market functioning has been restored, increasingly, particularly the large-scale asset purchases, are providing monetary stimulus. We certainly have options going forward. We can scale those programs. We've seen central banks around the world try other things, yield curve control, forward guidance. These things are all in our toolkit. What I can tell you is that going forward, The types of measures we take will depend on the circumstances. Different measures have different effectiveness in different circumstances, and they will be guided by the achievement of our inflation target. We'll be flexible, we'll be resolute, we're going to be innovative, and we're going to be determined.
Thank you. Just before we go to the next question, for those reporters who were late in joining the call, if you have a question, let us know by sending an email to communications@bankofcanada.ca and we'll put you in the queue. Pour les journalistes qui se sont joints à l'appel avec un peu de...
For journalists who are joining the call late, please send a short email to the email address specified if you wish to ask a question, and your name will be added to the list.
From Shelley.
Hi, Governor. This is Shelley Hagan with Bloomberg News.
Hi, Shelley.
When the time does come to remove emergency stimulus, do you anticipate you'll reduce your balance sheet first before raising rates?
Look, we have all the tools we need to exit. But exit is a long way off. We're at the very beginning of recovery from an unprecedented drop in GDP. We expect in the immediate coming months, we do expect to see some pretty good growth numbers, both jobs and GDP. But we do expect that, following this initial reopening phase, there will be a slower, longer recuperation phase.
Okay, we seem to have run into a little technical hiccup there with the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and that's too bad because he was saying something that was pretty interesting. We'll bring it back to you as soon as we get it up and running. But basically, the Governor was asking, at what point does the bank start scaling back monetary policy, which is, of course, what the bank controls, which it is currently using not only to backstop, financial institutions like your banks, but also whole provinces. The Governor of the Bank of Canada is saying that this is really the very, very beginning of the recovery, and that he does expect to see better job numbers and better GDP moving forward, but that it will be a slow recuperation phase of this recovery, and of course very different than previous recoveries, for instance, after the recession in 2008. So we will bring that back to you if we get it. If not, I will go back to the other press conference happening right now with the President of the Treasury Board and federal public health officials. Let's dip into that.
Pouvez-vous nous dire de plus que la semaine dernière, parce que la semaine dernière, on disait au plus peut-être 17 milliards par mois. Aujourd'hui, que pouvez-vous nous dire là-dessus?
What can you tell us? Answer. This is a legitimate question. Minister Qualtrough, Minister Leboutillier, and Minister Morneau are working hard in order to create forecasts. Minister Qualtrough last week said $17 billion as an estimate per month, and this number was based on the first month. And after the first month, there was a decrease in applications between March and May, a decrease of about 20%. And since May, with things reopening, we're expecting this decrease to be even more significant. I think that for a good journalist such as yourself, you'll be able to get an idea of the future by looking at the data from March to May, and we want to be more specific, give more specific data, and that's why those three ministers will have better estimates shortly. Question, when will this be available? Answer, as quickly as possible, but we want to be precise more than we want to be quick. On June 5th, we got data on employment. We can forecast applications from July to August. So we were waiting on this employment data that we received on June 5th so that we can use economic and statistic methods to give us a more accurate idea of the future. Next question, please.
Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de l'inaudible avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead, à vous la parole.
Hello, Mr. Duclos. I have a question regarding public servants who should be able to go back to work. There's about 150,000 of them. You should have an idea of how these public servants are working. Do you have a number on how many of them could go back to work and work in those offices and maintain physical distancing without taking into account, of course, local situations? How many people would be able to go back to their office? Answer. I'll answer your question in just a moment, but I just want to come back to some data that I forgot to mention regarding telework. At the beginning of the crisis, we were concerned about the Government of Canada being able to offer telework to hundreds of thousands of public servants. Over the past few weeks, I was able to note that double the amount of public servants were able to have secure access to the network. There were 140,000 connections before the crisis, and now we're at 280 secure connections. This is a lot of connections that the employees can use, and we're at 100,000 employees of the public service who can simultaneously, in different groups, of course, who can be participating in virtual meetings, and as well our teleconference capacity, which is quite important regarding telework. Our capacity went from 1.6 million to 3.6 million per day, so we tripled our ability to work in teleconference mode. A lot has changed at the public service, and so telework is more possible now, but it is also a lot more efficient than it was before the crisis. We're not talking about the return of public servants to work. We're talking about their return to their offices, because public servants have been working over the past weeks, and some of them were working even harder than they were before the crisis because they were in crisis management mode. So I just want to be specific here. We're talking about a return to their physical office and not their return to work. Now, coming back to your question, Minister Annan, who is responsible for PSPC procurement, has been working closely with the different departments.
Okay, we're jumping around a lot today, but want to take you back now to the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem. We've managed to reestablish the connection, and he is taking questions now.
Shifted the weights in the index to be more reflective of the buying patterns of Canadians right now. And what you see when you do that is that inflation, measured inflation, hasn't fallen quite as much as total CPI, although there's not a huge gap between them. What I would say going forward is that some of the shifts we've seen in spending patterns are going to unwind as we get back to more regular shopping activities. There'll probably be some effects that are more persistent. I mean, clearly, spending on, going to, large entertainment events with thousands of people, that's not happening anytime soon. So, some of these effects will be more persistent. The work that we're doing here, aided by StatsCan, will really try to look through these more temporary effects that are going to unwind and factor in the more enduring effects.
I think we can squeeze in the two last questions, first by Tony Mace of Mace News, followed by Jordan Press of Canadian Press. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi, Governor. It's Tony Mace from Mace News. Thanks for taking my question. You mentioned that the upcoming monetary policy report would include a central scenario. I'm wondering what kind of assumptions about COVID that scenario might incorporate, or what other kinds of scenarios the bank is considering. I mean, you mentioned in managing COVID that it's important to, or the hope is that any outbreaks be managed on a local basis as opposed to national shutdowns. I'm just wondering how you think about that in terms of the various scenarios.
So I haven't, seen the forecast yet that the staff is presenting. So I'm looking forward to that. There's a process between now and July 15th. But I think at a high level, it's probably safe to say that the central scenario is not going to include a second major economy-wide shutdown. There will be risks around that central scenario, and that would be one of them. I think the central scenario, though, would embody the reality that there probably will be some more local flare-ups, and so that will be affecting supply on an ongoing basis. As I said before, hopefully with each flare-up, we get better at targeting it, isolating it, and closing it down faster than the one before.
Thank you. The last question is from Jordan.
Oh, hi, good morning, good afternoon, Governor. I just wanted to ask, you talked in your speech about that this pandemic is likely to inflict some lasting damage to demand and supply. And I'm just curious if you can maybe talk a bit about some of the early indications that you're seeing about that lasting damage so Canadians can understand what you mean by that.
Actually, right now, it's pretty hard to see it because the government has provided very large-scale transfers to households, supports for business, CERB, the wage subsidy, and they have, for households, those transfers are replacing the income they've lost from COVID. As we get through, and even in this next first reopening phase, as I said, I think you're going to see some pretty good job growth numbers. You're going to see some good GDP growth numbers as supply comes back online. As we get through that reopening phase, though, we do think that the pace of the recovery will slow. And that will reflect the reality that not everybody's job is coming back. It'll reflect the fact that some companies aren't going to make it to the other side of this. New companies will form. Existing companies will seize new opportunities. But that takes some time. And through that, that's going to be a slower, a bumpier process that is going to require ongoing support.
And that concludes today's press conference. Thank you very much, Governor, and thanks for everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, that was as much as we could get of the first press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and part of the reason why we wanted to bring that to you. He has, the Governor, Tiff Macklin, appeared in front of some parliamentary committees, but today he was giving a speech and then followed up by some questions. And of course, his view on where the economy is going is really important for our understanding of what might be happening over the coming months, and of course for to understand what the government also might be doing. So let's bring back my colleagues, Vashi Kapelis and David Cochran. So apologies that we didn't get all of it, but we got some parts that I thought were nonetheless important. And I think one of the things that he highlighted there at the end, and I'll get you both to win because I know you're both interested in this stuff as well, is that job growth and GDP, gross domestic product, will improve in the third quarter. There's no doubt about it. But things are going to look different. And that is not only what the Bank of Canada is contending with, but it's certainly what the government is contending with as they get this fiscal snapshot up and ready. Vashi.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting to hear it from him and then sort of match along with that what you feel like when you're out back in this sort of newly reopened world, right? And by that I mean what I thought really stuck out at the end there for me was when he said that after the reopening, recovery will be slow. It will not be as you expect, right? Many businesses will no longer be there. People don't necessarily have jobs to go back to. And most especially once the government stops supplementing people's income, you will have maybe, and I'm interpreting here, a more accurate picture of what that recovery, that true recovery will look like, or or if it's not really a recovery, or to what degree, basically. And I think I was sort of thinking that this weekend as I went out. I was in Toronto and I was in Ottawa, obviously the weekend before, as everything was reopened. And there are many businesses that are no longer there. And I think it's, when we're inside, it's harder to sort of see, I guess, to the same degree, the impact on not just individuals, but people who own businesses or those businesses itself. There are lots of restaurants, for example, who are not part of any reopening phase in so much of the country at the moment, that are no longer operating, that have just simply closed their doors because they can. And I was often sort of reflecting and thinking about, well, that has to fundamentally alter the economy for a long time. And to that degree, Mr. Macklem, the governor, also talked about, for example, the prospect of government stimulus different than supplementing someone's income or helping out with wages, but actually stimulating the economy during a recovery period. And he would not put a calendar date on it. He it's going to come at some point, but it's certainly, he didn't even want to say when it could come, because that's just too difficult at this point. I just felt like it really underscored what is happening outside as this reopening begins. I feel somewhat optimistic, and a lot of people do, because it's nice to have a bit of normalcy back in our lives. But it truly isn't really what it was before the pandemic, right? And I think what I got from this message was it won't be for a very, very long time. And there are implications for the fiscal policy of the government for that. Take the wage subsidy, for example, is something that the Prime Minister mentioned. He keeps asking employers, highlighting the ones who have, and asking others to take him up on it. That's going to be extended till the end of August. Right now, they've got under half the applicants that they thought they would for the program. How will they amend the program? They're promising changes to it, the extension of it. What exactly does that mean for employers who are supposed to or trying to access it? I think those questions are ones that the government still has to tackle with, and obviously very quickly, because, as I said, there are a lot of businesses considering those questions. How long do I keep open for? Can I stay open? That kind of thing. And I just felt like Mr. Macklem certainly underscored a lot of that.
Yeah, and I should say that this comes on the day when we are expecting the Premier of Ontario at the top of the hour there to talk about some relaxation for Toronto, for Peel, but not for everywhere. Windsor-Essex remains in stage one. So that means hairdressers, patios, the things that we've seen in Ottawa and other parts of Ontario start to reopen. I know many other places, of course, in the country already well underway there, but Ontario has been lagging behind, and that becomes a problem for the economic engine of the country as well. Also, super interesting, I thought, David, that he talked about if we have to shut down again, that it won't be as dramatic. It sounded like he was suggesting that because we will have a better sense of how to control the virus, that the economic shutdown would also look different moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of have an evolving playbook on this, right? We have an idea of what we can do. There is a PPE says not. Personal protective equipment is not as in short supply as it was at the beginning of this. We have an idea of what we need to do. We've got a sense of where the capacity is in the healthcare system, and we just know more about the virus. But that being said, like forecasters, the thing they always caution against is uncertainty. And the single greatest source of uncertainty right now is what's going to happen with the virus, right? So you heard Tiff Macklem, the governor there, talking about in July they're going to come out with a central scenario that is going to, as in his words, look like a forecast. So it's not really going to be your standard kind of forecast. And this sort of builds on what we've heard from the federal government, and that some people say they want to see some sort of a fiscal update or a fiscal statement from them. We're getting instead a fiscal snapshot, because they're just flat out saying we can't give you something with the rigor that we normally give you with the 1 year, 3 year, sort of 5 year outlook. So it'll be interesting to see the level of detail in what Bill Morneau gives us on the 8th of July versus what Tiff Macklem gives us in July at the next sort of set announcement from the Bank of Canada. But, you know, it just speaks to the fact, Rosie, that we are still, while things are reopening and we're all talking about recovery, because I think we have this natural human impulse to want to get back to recovery, we're not out of the emergency phase of this yet. Right? Like the extension of the CERB, the wage subsidy rolling out to the end of August, they're still putting a floor on the Canadian families, Canadian businesses, and the Canadian economy as much as you can. I mean, we talk about how disappointing the wage subsidy uptake has been. It's 2.6 million people. That is 16% of full-time jobs in the country now on the federal government wage subsidy. When you look at the wage subsidy and the CERB, you have anywhere between 30 to 50% of the Canadian labor force on government support, and that doesn't even include municipal government employees, provincial government employees, or federal government employees. We're just not at the phase where the economy is anything like normal. And when Tiff Macklem says, yeah, we're going to see some growth in the third quarter, that's kind of the bounce back from this unprecedented historic drop in GDP. But then where does it go after that? We get this lift because, you know, some retail with curbside doors can open up, and there is some money coming back into the economy. But you look at the numbers that follow. A Bloomberg reporter in the U.S. today, because so much of our economy is depending on the United States. In Arizona, more than 20% of all COVID tests came back positive. Just think about that. They've had 144% growth in cases since Memorial Day. So like more than half of the states in our biggest economic dependent, because as the U.S. economy goes, the Canadian economy goes with it, they're out of control in a lot of these states versus the near control that we have in Canada right now. So there's just so much uncertainty and so many factors and all the big economic inputs to the Canadian economy that nobody can say anything with any certainty on where this is going to go or how it's going to get back to normal.
Yeah, I also found it interesting. Obviously, everyone's doing their best to try and make projections or get a sense of what's next. And even the governor's thoughts on how spending is changing for Canadians. Obviously, if you have extra money, and not everybody does right now, most purchases are being made online. But even the fact that some of the spending that people would naturally tend towards, if they have extra money, going to restaurants, going to concerts, going to movies, those things too become sort of not things that you're going to do, or not things that you feel comfortable doing, or not things that are possible. So even him speculating about the change in long-term spending habits for Canadians as we move into whatever this next part is, was very interesting, because obviously that then hits Canada's bottom line. It has all sorts of consequences there. Let's just talk, if we can, a little bit about the public service. We didn't take much of that press conference, but essentially the president of the Treasury Board has prepared a document to allow the public service some sense about what's happening and what conditions have to be in place. But what he said in that press conference was that, hey, everybody's working from home and it's actually going better than we thought it was going to, which I think for a lot of people has been part of the conclusion that you can, not all jobs of course, but you can get people working from home and it can be quite efficient and effective, Ashi.
Yeah, I think it can, and I think I don't know if your conversations are the same, but most public servants I talk to don't expect to go back to work at any point, and my understanding is the government will sort of embark on quasi-negotiations to try and figure out, like they have a guidebook, but to try and figure out how that might play out, but it'll be a number of months, I think, before physically the process even starts. If I could, I wanted to highlight the one sort of, I think, important caveat, not just for the public service, but for so many people who will remain working at home for a while. And that's something I'm inundated with correspondence on, and that's about childcare and going back to school. And I know it varies and the plans vary depending on the province you're in, but in some provinces like this one, for example, there's the idea that some kids might only go to school for a certain number of days or every other week, or there might be a rotation. And I know that school boards in many other provinces are considering something like that. There have been issues with daycares, even though that they are allowed in so many provinces, along with this reopening process, to do the same. It's not so cut and dry because they have to limit the number of kids, and they have a financial model that they need to sort of base their decisions on when it comes to that. And so the number one thing I'm hearing, particularly from women in the workforce, but also men who are tasked with taking care of their kids while they are at home trying to do full-time jobs, is that A, it's been really difficult, and the solutions proposed so far are not necessarily meeting the requirements, right? So, and I know it's an evolving situation, and certainly governments of all stripes are not going to get it right away. And it also depends on where we are when it comes to the virus, but particularly confusion about going back to school in September. I mean, if you have 3 kids and each of them have different days that they're going to be in school, and they're young, and you can't afford childcare in your home, like how do you figure out how to do your job while at the same time take care of your kids. I think that is going to be, as we talk about, for example, the potential for recovery beyond just the first bump that we see through reopening, I think that's going to be one of the big questions that affects the sort of the speed at which that recovery happens, or the degree to which it happens, because a lot of people I hear from are having a tough time doing both at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, school is coming to an end for lots of students across the country, but that doesn't mean that they suddenly have things to do, or they're somewhere else to send the kids, and that's part of the problem. And I should say the public service, there are no dates attached to a return. In fact, many public servants are being told, don't expect to get back into your office in a sustained way, at least until January. But it's interesting, the kinds of things that are being discovered that are possible during a pandemic in terms of telework, because as you point out, Vashi, if there is no childcare, if there is no school, that's really the only option, and employers sort of have to make that work too. David, I'll go to you on that too.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're an example of what's possible during a pandemic. The newsroom behind me is normally pretty full. It's a ghost town. The major shows that we do every day on television or radio are being produced out of people's kitchens and living rooms rather than in the control rooms. And the Federal Public Service is one of the biggest employers in the country, is no exception to that. You know, like a lot of people in Ottawa, I have civil servants as neighbors. And there's ups and downs to this whole thing, right? In terms of like, you can have more meetings because everyone's available and able to get on Zoom, as opposed to having like a physical limitation of meeting space, for example, that you might have in an office. So it is causing a rethink on the future of work. And I know Jim Stanford has done some work on this, the former CAW economist who splits his time now between Australia and Canada. And this is a big transformation that is going to happen. What is also interesting on this, Rosie, is on the private sector side, you're seeing a lot of articles come out of people saying that if we're going to expect people to work from home, that means they don't need to live in Toronto with the hot real estate market. They can live in a cheaper real estate market, and maybe that means we can pay them a cheaper salary. I think that's going to be quite a fight because, look, okay, fine, maybe I can live in a cheaper housing market, even though the company I work for is based in Toronto, but you save on rent, you save on utilities, you save on internet, you save on mortgage or whatever. So there is a big conversation as we try to get back to normal, as things sort itself out and people try to change what they're doing. We've seen big tech companies like Shopify going to digital by default and sending everybody a couple of $1,000s so they can set up a home office, and they're going to reduce their office footprint and have most of their workforce work from home. The government may be willing to explore that kind of a thing. It will obviously move slower than a disruptor like a tech company would on doing these issues, but they have the plan. But again, the lack of a timeline just speaks to just how far away from normal absolutely everything is. A lot of jobs are going to be lost. A lot of companies are going to fail because of what we're going through. And like we like to talk about GDP, and I think it was Bobby Kennedy who said GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. A lot of these smaller businesses who make neighborhoods so important are going under. You're seeing that with restaurants that people love, favorite lunch spots. They're all just gone. So when the dust settles on this, there's going to be a recalibration and a rebuilding that is going to just simply have to take place.
I only have about say a minute and a half left for both of you. I just want you to just weigh in on what if anything we expect on the China file. Then I mean, we saw a sort of an expected retaliation. In quotes from China. We only have about 30 seconds actually, but so just quickly, both of you, what you expect on that front, Vashi?
I don't expect much to change. I think the Prime Minister was pretty clear today, and in repeating what he said prior to this. I think that China is responding to something that he said before. They say it's irresponsible. I don't anticipate that will change the reaction of this government. I also don't anticipate they will stop getting criticism from the opposition for not taking a more public, hard line against China, and I just don't see their positions changing.
20 seconds, David, sorry.
Yeah, Rosie, I think it'll be a little bit like a swan gliding across the pond, looking very calm and normal above, working furiously underneath. No real change in the rhetoric, hoping the backroom negotiations can yield some efforts while trying to build an international coalition to provoke change, but China does not seem to be affected by this at all.
Okay, thank you both very much for your coverage. Appreciate it. You can see Vashi later on CBC News Network at 5 Eastern and David later, wherever he might pop up. Thank you. I'm Rosemary Barton. This has been CBC News Network, our special coverage today. Andrew Nichols picks up our coverage from here. I'll see you back here tomorrow.